very generous welcome that you both have extended to me, of the two heads of the two colleges. Thank you for the very generous welcome. So this talk will be on Sriniketan. I hope the students have heard of Sriniketan. It's really quite forgotten. I know you have all heard of Shantiniketan, but Sriniketan was also a very great endeavor of the Shantiniketan experiment. It was together, but it has got a little forgotten. But it was unique and extraordinary, actually, in its purpose. In fact, when I wrote a history of Sriniketan, am I audible?
Yes.
When I wrote a history of Sriniketan, which was published in 2022, several reviewers were amazed that a poet, and a poet of the kind that Rabindranath Tagore was, did such exceptional work for the villagers and the villages surrounding his Shantiniketan school. Again, that was actually evidence of how forgotten, how sadly forgotten Sriniketan is. So I hope all of you will find this not just interesting, but quite extraordinary. And of course, this work that I'm going to be presenting is on the arts and crafts movement, which actually was not just initiated in Shantiniketan and Sriniketan, but became a part of India's great movement of the cottage industries program ever since the country's independence. So it remained separate. It did not become a part of the cottage industries movement, but it indeed was probably foundational to that movement. And the leaders of the cottage industries movement, ladies like women like, great women like Kamala Devi Chattopadhyay, has acknowledged this very profusely, that it was really the Shantiniketan-Sriniketan experiment in arts and crafts and their contribution that helped India's cottage industries movement to flourish. So Sriniketan, its pioneering work in artistic crafts, and the period is 1920s to 1930s. The Sriniketan Institute of Rural Reconstruction, as it was originally named, was officially founded in 1922. Its purpose was village reform. Only Sanskar. This work of village reform, however, began well before Sriniketan was established in the Tagore family's estates in East Bengal during 1890. Is it not too audible? I beg your pardon, কি বলছেন? আসছে না? বড় করে দিলেন, খুব ভালো, thank you. খুব ভালো, thank you. So let me go back then. The Sriniketan Institute of Rural, I'm very glad that it's right so high because I think everyone can see it. Is that right?
Yes.
Those are the map, you can all see it. And now that it's been enlarged kindly by one of my colleagues here, I am very grateful. So the Sriniketan Institute of Rural Reconstruction, as it was originally named, was officially founded in 1922. Its purpose was village reform. This work of village reform, however, began well before Sriniketan was established. And it took place in the Tagore family's estates. Shal জমিদারি ছিল ঠাকুর পরিবারে, জোড়াসাঁকো ঠাকুর পরিবারে, পূর্ব বাংলায়. So the Tagore family's estates in East Bengal during 1890 to 1900. ওই সময় দিয়ে কাজটা শুরু হয়েছিল. When Rabindranath was sent by his father, Maharshi Devendranath, to manage the family's agricultural estates in East Bengal, with its headquarters at Shilaidaho. The work was continued and taken forward at Sriniketan when Rabindranath moved to Shantiniketan in 1901. I guess many of us would know that the Shantiniketan school, as we know it today, was founded in 1901 at the turn of the century by Rabindranath. It was an experiment in alternative education. There he bought 12 bighas of land in a village called Shurul, within 2 miles of Shantiniketan, to continue the work of village reform or rural reconstruction, as was the global term used in the early period. This came to be named Sriniketan. Being the poet and artist that Rabindranath was, it would not be fair to think of his ideas in rural reconstruction as ideas and targets only to obtain the economic development of the villages. There was the other, no less important goal of bringing joy to the lives of the village people. He knew intuitively that poverty was not the only problem. Unhappiness was also a problem. I hope I'm not too quick. Rabindranath wrote in 1922, "It is hard to imagine a life as cheerless as in our rural areas. It is far from easy to do something for people who have cultivated weakness for centuries and do not know what self-help is. Still, I had to make a start." Quote unquote. I'm not sure if many of you would know, the students in particular, I'm sure the teachers do, of this wonderful collection of letters called Chinnopatra, or Chinnopatra Boli. There are 2 editions, which were letters that Rabindranath wrote at that time, in the 1890s, to his niece, Indira Devi Chaudhurani, describing his village work. And all these references, like it is hard to do anything really creative for the village people, is difficult because they do not know what self-help is. They have never known what self-help is, at the time is. They did not ever know what Atma Shakti is. And so when they were asked to do something constructive, they thought they were not fit for it, that they had no skills of their own. And they also misunderstood the whole effort, thinking that, oh, such work will send our master to heaven, but we shall remain where we are. So there was a great deal of self-depreciation among the poor people of our country, who never actually believed that anything good could come out of their lives or come out of them. So this is what he meant, that it is far from easy to do something for people who have cultivated weakness, who have lived with weakness, who have accepted weakness, so cultivated weakness for centuries, and do not know what self-help is. Still, I had to make a start. The founding idea was premised on a unique proposition of bringing life in its completeness, within inverted commas. These are, of course, translations from his writings in Bangla, Only Prakriti. I hope some of you the students will make notes of these works, because that will help you to understand Rabindranath's life and his work. So life in its completeness, not just economic reform, not just artistic work, not just agricultural improvement, but life in its completeness, একটা সম্পূর্ণতা জীবনে, যাতে তাদের জীবনে আসতে পারে. To the Indian village, through the Sriniketan, Sriniketan alternative education. Alternative education, because at that time in our country, which was colonized at the time, there were two kinds of education. One was, of course, the colonial schooling, right, which was not quite part of our culture, but Western education, as we call it, and indeed that has also become now a part of our education. Here I am speaking to you in English. So, and why not? And all of you learn and study in English. But there was also the ancient or the medieval systems of the pathshalas and the madrasas, etc. So alternative education was an education that Rabindranath wanted to bring about, which would be based on our culture. It would be a modern method, as he said in his own words, a modern method of education, but situated in our own culture, which colonial education was not. So that was the whole idea, and I mean, basic idea. There were many ideas that actually were naturally grouped in the foundational idea too. This education was created on the goal of bringing the city and the village close. That was a very important idea. City and village close. Sriniketan school had students who came all from the cities. Yet Sriniketan school was surrounded by villages. Because why? Because India was basically a rural population, right? The majority lived in the villages, and this is why Gandhiji and Rabindranath Tagore were so keen for village reform. So this education was created on the goal of bringing the city and the village close. Not easy, but I have to make a start, he said. By giving elementary education in the sciences to the students. So by giving elementary instruction in the sciences to the students, combining it with their practical work at grassroots, training them to observe the environment, which in colonial education was completely absent. It was entirely classroom study. And connecting it to their everyday life. This was one of the main principles. You know, it's not good to study one thing and to see nothing of that outside. Then you don't make that connection. Another unique aspect of this alternative education was to include awareness and training in art and craft, which is what I'm obviously going to speak about mainly, not the other aspects. There were many other aspects that one could certainly bring into a history of Sriniketan. So, as a part and parcel of the students' everyday lives, art is very important to life. Art is very important to human emotions, art and music. Innovative design for everyday things was integral, therefore, to Sriniketan's art and craft syllabus. This is how it was. It was not that art wasn't there. Even our things of daily use could be very beautiful. Like the mati bhar. We all love the mati bhar. It is a very pretty object. But it wouldn't do to just keep it at that. It had to be developed because there was so much more art. And creativity is one of the main things that art makes for our lives, and that by which art flourishes. Creativity is the main thing by which art flourishes. So innovative design, new designs for everyday things that we use in our lives was integral to Sriniketan's art and craft syllabus. Because remember, the villagers knew the everyday things that they made themselves. So, but should they just remain with those? Or should they make those objects more creative, more designed, so to speak? As you know, design has become a very important thing in our lives. The creation of beauty was given an important place in the very many ideas of an alternative education. A revolutionary move taken by the Sriniketan experiment was in the inclusion of cottage industries as an essential part of the program for rural reconstruction. I hope, and I'm addressing this to the students, I hope you understand the difference between industrial art and cottage art. In other words, what is cottage industry? Something that you can develop at home, something that you can learn, something that you can design with the help, of course, of trained artists, but also through your own creativity. So that's cottage industries. That is really coming from within society. So a revolutionary move taken by the Sriniketan experiment was in the inclusion of cottage industries as an essential part of the program for rural reconstruction. The need to give creative expression to the human being's natural emotional responses was essential to Shantiniketan's and Sriniketan's way of life. The idea was to appeal to the natural artist in each individual through drama, dance, and music. Remember, I mentioned life in its completeness. So life in its completeness includes all of these things: drama, dance, music, art. Otherwise, life would not have been complete. I'm sure all of you have realized this by now. By the same token, attention was given to creativity in design. Create more design. Just don't stay with the designs that you've inherited. For the objects of everyday use, through Shantiniketan's Kala Bhavan. Some of the students would know that Shantiniketan's Kala Bhavan was led by a very great artist called Nandalal Boshu. And Rabindranath used to insist that Nandalal Boshu would also train the villagers in creative art. After all, he was only really basically teaching city-born students who were already artists themselves, in a sense. They had chosen art to be their future. But the villagers also needed to be involved in this. And so Nandalal was encouraged to come to the villages of course he would come to the villages, that's nothing extraordinary, but that he would also involve the villagers in this art movement that was so famous in our country. The Sriniketan art movement was one of the very leading art movements in our country. So he used to say, invite our artist Nandalal to meet the village craftsmen. He may stimulate them into producing new and original designs. A 1929 report from the entire venture, the Sriniketan venture, wrote, quote, research in indigenous dyes, indigenous dyes and in new patterns is carried on, and the results are tried out at the institute before taking them to the weavers or for teaching their apprentices. See, what you need to understand, and again I'm addressing this to the students, that weaving, tatbona, was a form of art that was completely indigenous to India, right? It was not as if there wasn't any art. It was just that it hadn't been developed beyond that basic level, right? So weavers were there. In fact, weavers were there in large numbers. But now what Sriniketan was doing was to bring more design to the weavers, more skills to the weavers, because every form of learning needs more skills, more, therefore, training. There were 214 students in the weaving section who came from various backgrounds and received training in making the dyes, mixing of colors, making your own colors. Some were weavers by caste, and some were school teachers. There was a wide spectrum of industries that the Sriniketan program of rural reconstruction encouraged and supported. These were, of course, weaving, we've already mentioned, tannery, carpentry, lacquer craft, pottery, bookbinding, embroidery, tailoring. There was also a mechanical workshop. All these industries were brought under Sriniketan's Shilpa Bhavana. Those of you who've been to Shantiniketan, I'm sure have seen Shilpa Bhavan. It still exists. It was fundamentally Rabindranath's foresight to supplement the villagers' activity with cottage industries. শুধু চাষ করে না জীবনযাপন করা. In 1911, he wrote a very telling letter to his son, Rathindranath, from their Potishwar estate. এই যে অনেকগুলো জমিদারি ছিল পূর্ববাংলায়, তার মধ্যে একটা নাম ছিল Potishwar. সেখান থেকে লিখছেন, অনেকভাবে আমি অনুবাদ করছি. I was thinking of what industries would be best suited for the cultivators of this locality. Potishwarer চাষীদের কথা বলছেন. কি শেখানো যায় ওদের, কি ইন্ডাস্ট্রি ওদের জীবনে আনা যায়? Nothing grows here except paddy. The only other thing they possess is hard clay. আমরা কি বলি ওটা, ওই মাটিটাকে যেটা খুব ব্যবহার হয়, ঠিক ঠিক, হ্যাঁ। তো ও শুধু শুধু ওইটাই আছে, তাহলে ভাবতে হবে যে ওইটা দিয়ে কি করা যায়, কি শিল্প সৃষ্টি করা যায়। So the only other thing they possess is hard clay. Can you find out, Rothinrathকে লিখছেন, ওখানে রথীন্দ্রনাথ কাজ করছিলেন তখন, if the village can collectively run such an industry with the help of a small furnace. Furnace মানে একটু ছোট আগুন লাগে তো ভেবে দেখার মতন কথা যে কিরকম ভাবে ভাবতেন। This is why I'm highlighting these things. It's not just a matter of, reeling out these facts, but what went behind these facts? What was the thinking that was going on? There's more here. It would be useful if they could manufacture rough plates and cups. Plate and cup to nana rokomer hoy. This is also pottery, glazed pottery. So this is not rough, this is smooth. কিন্তু ওদের যেহেতু ওই রকমই মাটি, সেহেতু ভাবছেন যে ওরা ওই রকম রাফ প্লেটস এন্ড কাপস করতে পারে, সেটাও খুব সুন্দর হতে পারে, এবং লাইক দ্য শামকি পটারি, নাম করা শামকি পটারি ইউজড বাই দ্য মুসলিম কমিউনিটিজ in their daily life. So you really need to think about these things. What is he trying to do? He's not trying to create art as an artificial thing in life, but art that of course needs to be designed and crafted, but also connected to one's daily life. Analytic Dharan. So that's one thing. There was more in that letter, but we will not go on that point right now. At that time of global industrialization, England and Europe were developing industrial technology. ওই মেশিন আসছে আমাদের সমাজে rapidly, and that was reflected in India's colonial policies. Rabindranath and Gandhi were not in favor of the colonial policy. They stood apart. They saw India's salvation in rural India, where the majority of their country's population lived. Both of them set out to work through an alternative education, Rabindranath and Gandhi, both of them, which included rural reconstruction. Gandhi in his ashrams and Rabindranath at Sriniketan, Sriniketan. So one is placing them within the history of that period, within what was happening in that period, historically, and by way of development. Industrial revolution was taking place globally. Shantiniketan and Sriniketan created a novel and sophisticated taste for these newly designed traditional crafts. Remember, I'm emphasizing that it was not that there were no crafts, but there were traditional crafts among India's cultured elite. I don't know if any of you have heard, but Shantiniketan is actually credited for bringing a new taste into Indian middle class life. New designs, new taste, new home decor, new use of vanity bags, new leather products that were never used earlier, beautiful products made of leather. The Shantiniketan-Sriniketan design came to be loved and reached not only the Calcutta's upscale market, but also the far away Sarabhai household in Ahmedabad. I would just like to add that the Sarabhai family was obviously very one of the leading families of India, and they were industrialists, but they were very moved by the designs of Sriniketan and Sriniketan. And I have, of course, through my research, personally been there, and several of their houses were designed from Shantiniketan and Sriniketan's art movement. I found these changes very interesting. However, in the 30s, there was a change in Sriniketan's outlook. I hope you have noted that up till now, it was more of a foundational thing as to what art could mean in the lives of all human beings, but particularly in this case, we are talking about the lives of the villagers. Since Shantiniketan and Sriniketan were completely rural in their settings, completely deep in the rural south, Rar Bangla, Shantiniketan, Sriniketan, Pratishthitan. This change really was bringing a kind of business outlook in Sriniketan's work. I've just said that all this artwork was reaching out to the markets in Calcutta, markets beyond Calcutta. And indeed, it's not as if business was not part of what people need for Atmashakti. So, just to go through these more cryptic, more specific lines, more focused lines, there was, however, a change in the 1930s, when it was becoming clear that Sriniketan was moving away from its foundational thrust on research and experiment, and from guiding the villager in self-reliance and Atmashakti. Sriniketan was to become business-oriented, starting from the late 1920s, progressively into the 1930s. This was reflected also on the productivity from the new agriculture which Sriniketan had been promoting. Again, one is not going into this, but for example, there was much experimentation in agriculture too. New crops were introduced, rotation crops were introduced, which obviously did not exist. So again, just as, let's say we are talking about the developments, the creativity in art and craft. Similarly, there was creativity and development in things like agriculture, which was so basic to life. Rothendranath Tagore, or Roti Babu, as he was addressed, drew up a reorganization scheme for Sriniketan in 1934 and updated it in 1938. There was quite a lot of criticism that he had to face for this. Sriniketan is moving away from its ideals, it is becoming a business. Not quite, but these criticisms are bound to happen. So both his new schemes, reorganization schemes, emphasized the importance of restructuring Sriniketan as a business. A business model was brought into Sriniketan's arts and crafts. It was in that background that Sriniketan's Shilpa Bhavana became a success story and turned into an independent business unit with a managing board of its own in 1937. Roti Babu wrote about that development. quote, "During a later visit to Europe in 1930, my wife Pratima Devi and I got ourselves interested in leatherwork. And on our return, many students used to come to learn this interesting work. Notun ashche, kokhono chamrar kaj, chamrar shilpo jetake bola hoy, age chilo na. All the leather work used to come from Europe, and very expensive too. So many students used to come to learn this interesting work, and the making of fancy articles from leather became the fashion. আজকাল যেগুলো সহজে আমরা পাই, আমাদের হয়তো খেয়ালও নেই যে কিভাবে এসেছে আমাদের জীবনে। We took advantage of this and opened a regular workshop for the goods. As a result, a large number of young men and women were trained in this industry, which spread throughout India. At this time, the weaving section was also making strides. The head of the weaving section was sent to Japan for training in the running of small-scale cotton mills. He brought back 10 power looms. I hope you know what the power looms are, the standing looms, as well as the accessories needed to feed into those machines. The Sriniketan's idea of introducing the power loom was to explore if every village could afford to have their own independent mill. So see, this is how they were spreading the work. And this is how they were obviously involving more and more villagers in this whole change, in this development, which was both artistic as well as commercial, as both are needed in life. The weaving section had been exposed to other kinds of looms. Sweden has gifted their model of the hand loom to Sriniketan. From it, Sriniketan adopted a Swedish design for curtains, bed covers, and tablecloths, which are still very popular. Sriniketan's creation of a Swedish design for its linen became very popular. A benefit of the Sriniketan scheme was that the village workers also worked from home. The 1939-1940 report shows that only 244 of the 466 workers, so almost half, were based in the villages. Worked directly from Shilpa Bhavan's, worked directly under Shilpa Bhavan's supervision. So once again, of the 466 workers, 244 were based in the villages, and they took instructions from Shilpa Bhavan, they took orders from Shilpa Bhavan, but worked from their home. They went home at the end of the 6 to 7 hours of work, 7 hours of their working day. The others took away the materials from Shilpa Bhavan and worked directly only from their homes. They got paid on delivering their products at a pre-arranged rate. Sriniketan was never, and that's the point one needs to take into mind, Sriniketan was never turned into a factory. See, do you see the differences? Industrialization means factories, but Sriniketan was actually industrializing cotton industries and never turning into a factory. That's a very important human point to keep in mind. There was another very significant social change through the Sriniketan work, through the Sriniketan enterprise, which was that they were not all caste workers. You have to recall, I know there are students of history and sociology, but mainly history, who should know that caste was very, very endemic to Indian, not was, still is, but then certainly even more endemic to Indian life. And you could only be a weaver at a certain point of time if you were by caste a weaver, which is if you were by birth a weaver. But this change, this is a very important change that came over. Of course, it was not a whole-scale change, but it was an important change, very important change. That in 1938, there were 39 caste workers and 206 others were non-caste. See, nobody today would ask you, what caste are you, if you wanted to become a weaver? If you wanted to join the famous weaver studio in Calcutta. Nobody would ask that. If they would ask it, they would only ask it constructively. If you came from a caste background of a weaver's caste, obviously you had something more to them. But you didn't have to. In 1939, there were 40 caste workers and 217 others. In 1940, there were 41 caste workers and 229 others. Now, I'm going to conclude by pointing out that with the years, there was often a dilemma in Vishwabharati's inner circles. Vishwabharati, the students would know, made up Sriniketan and Sriniketan. That was the international university. There was Sriniketan, there was Vishwabharati first, 1921, and then Sriniketan, 1922. So there was often a dilemma in Vishwabharati's inner circles. If Sriniketan's artistic products should grow as a business rather than remain as a center for creative design. These two, this is why I needed to actually bring this into the account, that you saw that there was a change and there was a business model that was brought into Sriniketan, which was absolutely inevitable for the sake of the villagers, otherwise the art would die out. While Rothi Babu legitimately believed, and I'm mentioning Rothi Babu here, because he in the last 20 years, it was he who actually steered the Sriniketan program. And that was a wonderful gift to his father. So while Rothi Babu legitimately believed that commercial success was a must, he held firmly to the founder's faith, that his father's faith, that Vishwabharati must experiment with designs and contribute to art. That must always remain a leading goal for Vishwabharati as the institution Rabindranath Tagore founded. Thank you.